I found out my best friend was living in my house for 2 years without me knowing. I had always prided myself on being a straightforward person. You know the type, no nonsense, plays by the rules, treats people the way you'd want to be treated. That's why when Marcus asked if he could rent my spare bedroom back in 2021, I didn't hesitate. He was my best friend since college. We'd been through everything together. Breakups, job losses, family drama, you name it, we'd survived it. When he found himself between apartments and struggling financially after a bad business venture, offering him the spare room at a reasonable rate seemed like the natural thing to do. It wasn't charity, it was what best friends did for each other. The house was perfect for this arrangement. Built in the late 90s, it had 4 bedrooms, 1 master where I slept, 3 others that I'd converted into a home office, a guest room, and Marcus's bedroom. The spare bedroom, which would later become the source of this entire nightmare, was tucked in the back corner of the house. It had its own bathroom, a small window that faced the backyard, and it was relatively private. Marcus seemed genuinely grateful. He moved in during the summer, and for the first few months, everything felt normal. We'd grab beers on weekends, he'd contribute to groceries, and he'd help with yard work. It felt like having a roommate who actually gave a damn. Life moved forward. I got promoted at work, started dating someone semi-seriously, and honestly just got caught up in the routine of existing. Marcus was quiet most of the time. He kept to himself, which I appreciated. I wasn't the type of guy who needed constant interaction or drama. So when I'd notice random things, like groceries disappearing faster than Marcus could eat them, or occasionally hearing movement in the spare bedroom on nights when I thought he was out, I didn't think much of it. I attributed it to Marcus having friends over, or maybe I was just tired and imagining things. My job was demanding, and I spent a lot of hours at the office. There were weeks where I barely paid attention to what was happening in my own home. Years passed without incident. Marcus paid his rent on time, usually in cash or through Venmo. He maintained the space, and honestly, I was grateful to have someone else in the house. It felt safer somehow, less lonely. We'd developed our own rhythm, respectful of each other's space, not intrusive. Sometimes we'd see each other in the kitchen in the morning and exchange pleasantries. Other times we'd go weeks with minimal interaction. I figured that was just how it worked when 2 adult men lived together. By the time 2023 rolled around, I'd stopped questioning anything. Marcus was just part of my life, like the furniture or the aging water heater. I'd introduce him to people as my roommate and best friend, and nobody ever questioned it. He was part of my story, embedded so deeply that I never felt the need to examine that arrangement too closely. That was my mistake. That was the moment I should have paid closer attention, should have asked more questions, should have trusted my gut on all those small, strange occurrences that I'd so easily dismissed. But I didn't. And 2 years later, everything would explode in a way I never could have anticipated. The first real hint that something was desperately wrong came on a completely ordinary Tuesday night in late January. I'd been working late and decided to swing by the grocery store on my way home. It was around 10:30 and I was exhausted. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and forget about the nightmare of a project meeting I'd had that afternoon. The store was nearly empty at that hour, which I was grateful for. I grabbed what I needed and headed home, the plastic bags rustling in the silence of my car as I drove through the dark streets. When I pulled into my driveway, something felt off immediately. There were 2 vehicles parked in front of the house. My own car was in the garage, so that was normal. But the second car, a beat-up Honda Civic with a check engine light that glowed like a beacon, was unfamiliar. I'd never seen it before. Marcus drove a Toyota Corolla, which was parked in its usual spot on the street. So whose car was this? I grabbed my groceries and walked toward the front door, my mind already spinning through explanations. Marcus had probably given his girlfriend a ride over, or maybe he was letting a friend crash for the night. That wasn't against the rules or anything. It was his space after all. As long as he wasn't throwing parties every weekend, I wasn't the type to police his social life. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, immediately hearing something that made me pause. It was music, coming from the back of the house, from the direction of the spare bedroom. This was strange. Marcus's room was in the back, yes, but the music wasn't blasting. It was subdued, almost intentionally quiet, like someone was actively trying to muffle it. I set my groceries down on the kitchen counter and walked toward the hallway that led to the spare bedroom. The closer I got, the more distinct the music became. It was some kind of indie rock, played at a volume that was conspicuously controlled. As I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door, I noticed something else. Under the doorframe, there was a thin line of light. The lamp in that room was on. I raised my hand to knock, but hesitated. Something about this felt intrusive. Maybe I was making a big deal out of nothing. Marcus was an adult. If he wanted to have someone over, he could. I turned around and walked back to the kitchen, unpacking my groceries with more force than necessary. The plastic bags crinkled loudly as I worked, my mind churning with increasingly irrational thoughts. By the time I'd put everything away, I'd convinced myself that I was being paranoid. This was fine, this was normal. I headed upstairs to my bedroom and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was quiet now. The music had stopped. Had Marcus turned it off when he heard me arrive? Or had whoever was in that room heard me come in and realized they needed to be quiet? The paranoia was creeping in now, that nagging feeling you get when your subconscious is picking up on something your conscious mind isn't quite ready to accept. I got up, walked to my bedroom window, and looked down at the unfamiliar Honda Civic sitting in my driveway. A Honda Civic that had no business being there. The next morning, the car was gone. I asked Marcus casually over breakfast if he'd had a friend over. He said yes, someone from work had crashed for the night. His explanation was simple, uncomplicated, believable. I accepted it without pushing further, because I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that my best friend wasn't lying to me. But over the next few weeks, the pattern became impossible to ignore. That Honda Civic showed up again and again. Always late at night, always gone by morning, always parked in a way that suggested someone was trying to keep a low profile. Something was happening in my house, something hidden just out of my immediate sight, and I had no idea what it was. By early February, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The pieces were starting to connect themselves in ways that made my stomach uneasy. The Honda Civic was becoming a regular fixture. I'd started noticing other things too, things that in hindsight seemed obvious, but that I'd been too trusting or too oblivious to recognize. There were 2 coffee mugs in the sink instead of 1. Dishes piled up faster than Marcus could reasonably create them. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the middle of the night coming from the spare bedroom, heavy and deliberate, definitely not the footsteps of my already-in-bed roommate. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I became hyper-aware of the house's rhythms, of its secrets. I began tracking when people came and went, keeping mental notes of car arrivals and departures. It felt paranoid, and it felt necessary at the same time. The logical part of my brain knew that asking Marcus directly was the adult thing to do, but another part of me was afraid of what the answer might be. If I asked and he lied, what did that say about our friendship? If I asked and he told the truth, what was that truth going to be? I decided to do something I'm not proud of. I set up my phone's location sharing app to trap when Marcus left the house and when he returned. I also started noticing his patterns. Marcus had recently changed his job situation, and he'd been somewhat vague about the details when I'd asked. Now he would disappear for long stretches during the day, leaving at odd hours, coming back at odd hours. Whenever he left, I started noticing that the spare bedroom's door would open at some point during his absence. Not always immediately, but usually within a few hours. One afternoon in mid-February, I took what felt like the nuclear option. Marcus had left for work around 8 in the morning. I sat in my own house, waiting, watching, and feeling absolutely crazy for doing it. By 11, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the spare bedroom door opening. I stood quietly at the top of the stairs, barely breathing. I could hear the sound of movement below, footsteps going toward the kitchen. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. This was it. This was the moment I was going to get an answer to the question I'd been afraid to ask. I walked down the stairs, slowly, trying to be casual despite the adrenaline coursing through my body. As I reached the bottom step, I saw him. A man, probably in his early 30s, standing in my kitchen in boxers and a t-shirt, casually pouring a glass of orange juice from my refrigerator like he owned the place. He looked up at me with an expression that shifted rapidly from shock to recognition to something that looked almost like guilty relief. Time seemed to stop. We stared at each other across my kitchen island, two strangers who shouldn't have been strangers at all, in a moment that changed everything. The man set the orange juice down slowly and raised his hands in a gesture of peaceful surrender, like I'd caught him in the act of committing a crime. In a way, I had. He opened his mouth to say something, but I couldn't process words yet. All I could process was the concrete reality of what I was seeing. There was a second person living in my house, not just visiting, but living. The evidence had been accumulating for months, probably years, but I'd been too blind to see it. That's when I heard the front door open. Marcus walked in, his expression falling the moment he saw us standing there in the kitchen. The jig, as they say, was officially up. Marcus froze in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a second or two. His face cycled through a series of emotions so quickly that it was hard to track them all: surprise, guilt, panic, resignation. The other man in my kitchen, the one I'd never met until this very moment, shifted his weight uncomfortably and looked toward Marcus as if seeking direction on what to do or say next. This simple gesture, this look, told me everything I needed to know. There was a hierarchy here. Marcus was in charge. This wasn't some accidental situation that had spiraled out of control. This was deliberate. This was planned. I found my voice, though it didn't sound like my voice anymore. It sounded hollow, betrayed, furious. I asked Marcus what the hell was happening. My words tumbled out in a rush, more accusation than question. How long had this been going on? Who was this person? Why had Marcus lied to me? Why had I been living with a complete stranger in my own home without my knowledge or consent? Marcus took a few steps further into the kitchen, his hands up in a placating gesture, much like the strangers had been moments before. He said my name, trying to use that tone that people use when they're about to give you bad news and they want you to stay calm. He told me his name was Derek, and that Derek had been renting the spare bedroom for about 2 years now. 2 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. 2 years. That wasn't some accidental situation or a momentary lapse in judgment. That was a sustained deception spanning nearly 700 days. I felt the anger building inside me like a pressure cooker with no release valve. My voice, when I spoke again, was different. It was colder. I asked Marcus if he'd been collecting rent from Derek, if he'd been pocketing money from subletting my house without my permission or knowledge. The hesitation before Marcus answered told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. He had been. Not just for a few months, for 2 years. He'd been taking my house, taking advantage of my trust, and profiting from it. Derek, standing silently in his boxers in the middle of my kitchen, finally spoke. His voice was quieter than I expected, more apologetic. He said he didn't know the lease situation was complicated, that Marcus had told him the spare bedroom was legitimately available to rent. The words were meant to shift blame, to somehow make this seem less culpable on his part. But Derek wasn't my friend. Marcus was. Marcus was the one who had sat across from me countless times, who had eaten at my table, who had smiled and told me everything was fine. Marcus was the one who knew exactly what he was doing. I told them both to get out of my sight. I needed them gone before I said or did something I would regret. Derek immediately started apologizing and retreating toward his room to get dressed. Marcus tried to talk to me, tried to explain, but I couldn't hear it. There was a ringing in my ears, a white-hot fury that was burning through every rational thought in my head. I walked away from him and went into my office, slamming the door behind me. For the next hour, I sat in that room and tried to process what had just happened. My best friend, my trust, my home, all of it compromised by someone I'd called my best friend since college. I pulled out my phone and started searching for information about tenant rights, landlord-tenant laws, and eviction procedures. I knew I needed to handle this carefully, legally, with documentation, but mostly I wanted Marcus and Derek out of my house as quickly as possible. When I finally emerged from my office, the house was quiet. I went downstairs and saw that Derek had packed a bag. He was sitting on the couch, looking miserable and genuinely frightened. Marcus was nowhere to be found. I asked Derek where Marcus was. Derek said Marcus had left, that he'd said something about needing to think, and that he'd be back to talk to me tonight. I told Derek that he needed to leave too, right then, immediately. Derek didn't argue. He grabbed his bag and left without another word, the Honda Civic pulling away from my house for what I hoped would be the last time. But Derek's departure wasn't the end of this. It was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning that was about to unfold. That night, I did something I probably should have done earlier. I called a lawyer. I spent 3 hours on the phone with an attorney who specialized in landlord-tenant disputes, explaining the situation in increasingly agitated detail. The lawyer listened patiently and then gave me the unfortunate news that this situation was more complicated than I'd hoped. Derek had been paying rent, which meant he could potentially be considered an actual tenant, regardless of the subletting arrangement. That meant I couldn't just throw him out on the street. There were legal processes that needed to be followed, proper notice that needed to be given, and documentation that needed to be established. The lawyer advised me to document everything, to get written statements about the arrangement, and to serve Derek with an official notice to vacate. The process could take weeks or even months, depending on how Derek chose to respond. When I asked about Marcus, the lawyer said that would be a civil matter between us, something we'd potentially need to handle in small claims court if I wanted to pursue recovering unpaid rent and utilities. The situation was frustrating, complicated, and legally precarious in ways I hadn't anticipated. I spent the rest of that night unable to sleep, pacing my house and trying to calm myself down. Marcus didn't come back that night or the next day. I sent him multiple messages asking for an explanation, demanding he meet with me so we could discuss what was happening. He responded with a short text saying he was sorry and that he needed some time to figure things out. Time? He wanted time after lying to me for 2 years? By the third day of silence, I decided to file a police report. I know what you're probably thinking. Police don't typically get involved in landlord-tenant disputes, but I went to the station and filed a report for fraud and unauthorized subletting of my property. The police officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but ultimately told me that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one. However, having the report on file might help me legally if Derek challenged the eviction notice. At the very least, it documented my version of events. I then sent Derek a formal notice to vacate, dated and signed, giving him 30 days to leave my property. I sent it via certified mail to ensure there was a record of delivery. I also drafted a similar notice for Marcus, though Marcus wasn't technically a tenant in the legal sense anymore since our agreement had been informal and verbal. I informed Marcus that he needed to vacate within 2 weeks and that I was pursuing legal action for the unpaid utilities and the rent he'd stolen from me through the subletting arrangement. The responses came quickly. Derek hired a lawyer and immediately contested the eviction, claiming that Marcus had verbally promised him a year-long lease that had been continually renewed. He claimed he was a legitimate tenant and that he had the right to proper notice and legal proceedings. Marcus, for his part, simply disappeared. He packed his belongings while I was at work one day and left without leaving a forwarding address or any contact information. He abandoned his apartment, or rather, my apartment, completely. I was left dealing with the legal fallout alone. Over the next few weeks, Derek's lawyer sent multiple letters contesting the eviction and claiming various tenant protections. I counterfiled with documentation of the unlawful subletting arrangement, copies of my lease terms, and the police report I'd filed. The situation escalated from the personal to the institutional, from a betrayal between friends to a legal battle that required court filings, legal representation, and countless hours of stress and frustration. The worst part was that Marcus, my best friend of 15 years, had simply vanished into thin air, leaving me to deal with the mess alone. About 6 weeks into the legal proceedings, I received a call from my bank. They were reporting suspicious activity on my account. Money had been withdrawn from my debit card at several locations where I'd never been, purchases made at stores I'd never visited, and cash withdrawals made at ATMs across town. Someone had stolen my card information. When I pulled up my financial statements online, my stomach dropped. The unauthorized charges had been happening for months, possibly longer. I immediately canceled my card and filed a dispute with the bank. Then I realized something that made the bile rise in my throat. I had a debit card stored on my computer, in a file on my desk in my home office, a place where Marcus had access, a place where Derek definitely had access if he was living in my house. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I also couldn't ignore the obvious connection. I called my bank back and asked them to provide me with a complete history of all the fraudulent transactions, including the timestamps and locations. Armed with this information, I went back to my lawyer. The lawyer immediately advised me to file a separate police report for fraud and identity theft. This time, the police took it much more seriously. A detective was assigned to my case, and I provided them with all the evidence: the bank statements, the timestamps, the locations of the fraudulent transactions. When I cross-referenced the locations and dates with my records of when Marcus and Derek had been present in my home, the pattern was unmistakable. The detective ran Derek's information and discovered he had a prior conviction for fraud and identity theft from 5 years prior. This changed everything. Suddenly, Derek wasn't just a shady subtenant. He was a criminal with a history of committing exactly this type of crime. The detective began investigating in earnest, pulling surveillance footage from ATMs and stores, trying to identify who had actually committed the fraud. When they finally got confirmation through video evidence, it showed Derek making withdrawals and purchases using my stolen debit card. Derek was arrested at his job 2 weeks later. The charges included fraud, identity theft, and theft of services for the unlawful subletting arrangement. In a strange twist of fate, Derek's arrest actually helped my case. With Derek now facing criminal charges, the civil eviction became almost irrelevant. Derek pled guilty to the fraud charges and agreed to make restitution for the stolen funds. The identity theft case was more complex, but the detective seemed confident about the outcome. But there was one piece of the puzzle that still didn't fit. How had Derek gotten access to my debit card information in the first place? I combed through my memory, trying to remember if I'd ever left my card lying around, if Derek had somehow photographed it, if I'd made some careless mistake that had enabled the theft. The detective suggested something I hadn't considered, that Marcus might have provided Derek with the information, that the two of them had been working together the entire time. I contacted Marcus, or rather, I tried to. He still wasn't responding to calls or messages. I reached out to mutual friends to see if anyone knew where he was, if anyone had heard from him. Nobody had. It was as if he'd vanished completely, erasing himself from my life and from the lives of everyone who'd known him. That's when I realized the most devastating truth of all. I had no idea if Marcus's entire friendship with me had been part of some elaborate scheme to gain access to my home and my valuables, or if he'd simply allowed Derek to exploit the situation for profit. Either way, the man I thought was my best friend had betrayed me in ways that went far deeper than I'd initially understood. The legal process dragged on for several more months. Derek pled guilty to the identity theft charges and was sentenced to 18 months in prison along with an order to pay restitution to me for the stolen funds and unauthorized charges. The civil eviction became moot once he was incarcerated. Derek's lawyer attempted to paint him as a victim of Marcus's manipulation, claiming Derek didn't know that Marcus was subletting illegally or that Marcus had given Derek my financial information without my consent. The narrative Derek's lawyer tried to construct was one of a desperate man who'd been taken advantage of by a more cunning friend. I didn't believe that narrative for a second. A man with a prior conviction for identity theft doesn't accidentally find himself in possession of someone else's debit card information. He goes looking for it. He either steals it or accepts it when it's offered. Either way, Derek was culpable, and the court agreed. The restitution order, while judicially sound, felt hollow because I knew Derek wouldn't have much money to pay back once he was released from prison years down the line. I'd probably never recover most of the money I'd lost. As for Marcus, he remained a ghost. I eventually hired a private investigator to try to track him down, partly for my own closure, but also because I wanted to understand what had happened, why he'd done this. The investigator tracked him to another state, where he'd apparently started using a different name and was working at a resort. But without concrete evidence that Marcus had directly participated in the fraud, the detective told me there wasn't much the police could do. Marcus hadn't technically stolen anything directly. He'd just provided Derek with access to my home and seemed to have looked the other way while Derek committed crimes. I filed a civil suit against Marcus for the unpaid utilities, the lost rent, and emotional distress. Marcus didn't show up to court or respond to the suit. I won by default, but again, it was a Pyrrhic victory. I had a judgment against Marcus for approximately $35,000 that I knew I'd probably never collect. He disappeared into the ether, unreachable, unburdened by the consequences of his betrayal. The emotional toll took longer to heal than the financial one. I'd lost not just money, but my sense of trust in people. I'd been naive, I realized, assuming that friendship meant something, that it provided some kind of protection against betrayal. I'd learned the hard way that some people can look you in the eye and lie for years, can smile and take your hospitality and your trust and turn it into profit or opportunity without feeling the weight of that betrayal. I went through a period of about 3 months where I couldn't have someone in my house without feeling paranoid. I installed additional cameras and a security system. I started checking my credit reports obsessively. I became the kind of person I'd never thought I'd be: suspicious, guarded, unwilling to extend kindness without extensive verification and background checks. It took therapy and time before I could start to heal from that emotional wound. Looking back now, nearly a year later, I can identify the warning signs that I missed. The odd sounds, the unfamiliar car, the food disappearing faster than it should have, Marcus's vagueness about his income and his job situation. All of these were red flags that I'd either ignored or explained away because I wanted to believe that my best friend deserved that trust. I wanted to believe that friendship was sacred, that it meant something real. The truth I learned was darker and more complicated. Friendship is only sacred to the people who honor it. When you extend trust to someone who doesn't respect it, when you're vulnerable with someone who's willing to exploit that vulnerability, you don't get to blame yourself for being betrayed. But you do get to learn from it. You get to set boundaries. You get to be more cautious about who you let into your spaces and your life. I sometimes wonder where Marcus is now, if he's using his con artists on someone else, if he's managed to build another version of the life he had here with me, or if he's learned any remorse for what he did. But mostly, I've made peace with not knowing. What I do know is that 2 years ago, someone I trusted more than almost anyone in my life was living a double life in my house, stealing from me while I slept upstairs, and I had no idea. That knowledge changed me, and while it didn't destroy me, it fundamentally altered how I see the world and how I move through it.